What's going on, everyone? And welcome back. If you've been spending your time in Conquest of Azeroth PvP, you've probably realized one thing already. PvP feels completely different from PvE. The classes that dominate raids aren't necessarily the ones dominating Battlegrounds or World PvP. Burst damage matters. Crowd control matters. Mobility matters. And sometimes surviving for another 10 seconds is more valuable than dealing another 100,000 damage. That's exactly why today's tier list is focused entirely on PvP. We're ranking every specialization based on how they currently perform in duels, battlegrounds, open-world PvP, and organized group fights. Now, before we begin, I want to make one thing very clear. Conquest of Azeroth is still incredibly new. Players are experimenting with builds every single day. People are discovering talent combinations nobody expected. Some specs that look average today might become absolute monsters after one balance patch or one newly discovered build. So don't treat this list as permanent. Instead, think of it as where the meta currently stands. Also remember, player skill matters more in PvP than almost anywhere else. A great player on an A-tier class can absolutely destroy an average player on an S-tier class. Positioning, cooldown management, knowing when to engage. Those things matter just as much as the class you're playing. With that said, let's jump into the specs currently dominating PvP. S-tier, the kings of PvP. These are the classes that seem to have everything. Excellent burst, strong survivability, reliable crowd control, great mobility, and the ability to completely take over a fight when played correctly. Shadow hunting witch doctor. Let's start with one of the biggest nightmares in PvP right now. Shadow hunting witch doctor. If you fought one recently, you already know why it's here. This specialization has an incredible combination of sustained pressure and crowd control. Instead of trying to delete you in one global cooldown, it slowly overwhelms opponents with curses, shadow magic, and constant pressure that never really stops. Every time you think you've stabilized, another curse lands. Another damage effect starts ticking. Another control ability forces you to react. That's what makes the class so frustrating to fight. It's constantly forcing mistakes. Another major advantage is survivability. Shadow hunting isn't overly reliant on standing still. It can continue applying pressure while repositioning around the battlefield, making it surprisingly difficult to shut down. In Battlegrounds especially, the specialization excels at creating chaos. Multiple enemies become cursed. Team fights become difficult to manage. Healers are constantly under pressure. It's simply one of the most complete PvP specs currently available. Stalker Venomancer. Next up, Stalker Venomancer. This class is terrifying. The first thing that stands out is mobility. Stalker players are constantly moving. They're never where you expect them to be. 1 second they're behind you. The next they're already setting up another burst combo. That movement alone makes them difficult to deal with. Then you add poisons. High sustained damage. Excellent single target pressure. And suddenly, you have one of the strongest duelists in the game. The class rewards patience. Good players don't just throw every cooldown immediately. Instead, they wait. They force defensive abilities. Then they strike at exactly the right moment. That's what separates average Stalker players from exceptional ones. When mastered, this specialization becomes one of the scariest assassins currently available. Infinity Chronomancer. Chronomancer continues proving that time magic is incredibly powerful, especially in PvP. The reason this specialization performs so well isn't just damage. It's control, manipulating cooldowns, speed, casting windows, positioning. Everything about the class makes it difficult for opponents to play comfortably. Good Chronomancers dictate the pace of a fight. They decide when combat speeds up. They decide when opponents struggle to keep up. They create opportunities that simply don't exist for other classes. Another huge strength is adaptability. Whether you're fighting one player or contributing during large battlegrounds, Infinity Chronomancer always seems capable of making an impact. It has answers for almost every situation. That's exactly what makes it an S-tier PvP specialization. Demolition Tinker. Demolition Tinker makes another appearance, but for slightly different reasons. In PvE, it dominates because of raw damage. In PvP, it dominates because nobody wants to stand near it. Properly timed explosives can instantly swing an entire team fight. Players grouped around objectives become easy targets. A single well-positioned burst combo can completely change the outcome of an engagement. Of course, landing those combos isn't always easy. Experienced opponents will try to avoid your setup. They'll interrupt your burst, force movement, pressure you before your cooldowns become available. That's why Demolition Tinker has such a high skill ceiling. The better you become, the more terrifying the specialization gets. A tier, excellent choices for most players. Not every class needs to be completely broken to succeed. These specializations are extremely competitive and can absolutely dominate in the right hands. Slayer Fellsworn. Slayer feels like it was designed for PvP. Aggressive, fast, explosive. Everything about the class encourages constant pressure. You're always looking for another opening, another gap closer, another burst combo. The specialization doesn't give opponents much breathing room. While it isn't quite as overwhelming as the S-tier classes, its ability to quickly eliminate isolated targets makes it incredibly valuable in almost every PvP environment. Crusader Templar. Crusader shines because of one simple reason: consistency. You know exactly what you're getting every match. Solid survivability, reliable burst, good sustained damage, and enough durability to survive mistakes that would immediately kill squishier classes. That reliability makes it one of the easiest PvP classes to recommend. New players can learn it quickly. Experienced players can push it surprisingly far. It's simply an excellent all-around specialization. Lightning Stormbringer. Lightning Stormbringer is one of the definition of high-risk, high-reward gameplay. When everything lines up, the burst damage is absolutely ridiculous. Enemies can lose massive chunks of health before they even realize what's happening. The downside: consistency. Some fights feel incredible, others don't. You're relying on key procs and proper timing to maximize your damage. But when it works, it's one of the most satisfying PvP specs in the game. Mechanic Tinker. Mechanic Tinker performs much better in organized PvP than many people expected. Turrets create incredible area denial. Objectives become much harder for opponents to contest. Battleground choke points suddenly become dangerous. It's not always the strongest duelist, but in larger fights, Mechanic becomes an absolute headache to play against. Teams that ignore its gadgets usually regret it. Maelstrom Stormbringer. Next up, we have Maelstrom Stormbringer, and this is one of those specs that can feel completely different depending on who's playing it. In the hands of an average player, it feels good. In the hands of a great player, it becomes an absolute nightmare. The biggest strength of Maelstrom isn't necessarily raw burst. It's pressure. You're constantly forcing enemies to react. Lightning, storms, elemental effects, they never really stop coming. That sustained pressure makes life incredibly difficult for healers because there's rarely a moment where the incoming damage completely disappears. Another thing I really like about this spec is its teamfight presence. Large battlegrounds are where Maelstrom really starts to shine. Whenever several players stack together, your abilities suddenly become much more valuable. Instead of threatening one opponent, you're creating pressure across an entire enemy team. It's not quite oppressive enough to reach S tier, but it's incredibly close. Infernal Fellsworn. Infernal Fellsworn continues proving why consistency is one of the most valuable qualities in PvP. Not every match is won by one massive burst combo. Sometimes victory comes from simply applying relentless pressure until your opponent finally runs out of defensive cooldowns. That's exactly where Infernal excels. The class has excellent sustained damage and enough survivability to stay in the fight much longer than many players expect. It also performs well in almost every PvP scenario: duels, battlegrounds, world PvP, small skirmishes. There's never really a situation where Infernal feels weak. That versatility alone makes it one of the safest PvP picks in Conquest of Azeroth. Wild Walking Primalist. Wild Walking Primalist is honestly one of the most exciting classes to play in PvP. Every fight feels different. Sometimes your burst windows line up perfectly and enemies simply disappear. Other times you're forced to kite, survive, and wait for another opportunity. That unpredictability is part of the fun. The specialization rewards players who know exactly when to commit and, more importantly, when not to. One bad engage can leave you exposed. But if you recognize the perfect opening, Wild Walking can completely turn a fight around in seconds. It's a class with a very high ceiling, and I expect its ranking to improve as players continue mastering it. B tier, strong, but more situational. Now we've reached B tier. And honestly, I think B tier is going to surprise a lot of people. These specs are absolutely capable of winning games. They're just a little more matchup dependent or require more effort to achieve the same results as the classes above them. That doesn't make them weak. It just means they're slightly more specialized. Zealot Templar. We'll start with Zealot Templar. This specialization is incredibly reliable. You know exactly what you're getting every single match. Solid burst. Good survivability. Simple rotation. Very few surprises. The reason it sits in B tier isn't because it's lacking damage. It's because it doesn't really excel in any one area. It doesn't have the insane mobility of Stalker. It doesn't have the overwhelming pressure of Shadow Hunting. And it doesn't have the explosive burst of Demolition Tinker. Instead, it's simply good. Sometimes that's enough. Especially for newer PvP players looking for a dependable class that's easy to learn. Rot Venomancer. Rot Venomancer has always been an interesting PvP specialization. Its biggest problem isn't damage. The damage is actually very respectable. The challenge is getting enough time to let that damage fully develop. Against experienced players, fights move incredibly quickly. People use line of sight. They cleanse effects. They force movement. That can make maintaining all your diseases and poisons much more difficult than it is in PvE. However, during longer engagements, Rot becomes much stronger. Objective-based battlegrounds are a great example. Constantly spreading diseases across multiple enemies creates tremendous pressure over time. It's definitely a class that rewards patience. If you enjoy slowly overwhelming your opponents instead of instantly deleting them, Rot Venomancer is still a fantastic choice. Archery Ranger. Archery Ranger feels exactly how you'd expect. If you can create distance, you're incredibly dangerous. Landing massive shots from long range never gets old. Unfortunately, PvP doesn't always let you play at maximum range. Mobile melee classes love diving onto archery rangers. Gap closers, interrupts, crowd control. Everything is designed to make your life difficult. That's why positioning becomes absolutely critical. A great archer always seems to find the perfect angle. A bad archer spends half the match running away. The skill ceiling is actually much higher than people give it credit for. Brigand Ranger. Brigand Ranger trades raw damage for versatility. You're constantly moving, using traps, creating openings, supporting your team. Rather than trying to carry fights entirely through damage, Brigand wins through smart decision-making. It's an excellent class for objective play, flag captures, resource defense, small skirmishes. Anywhere mobility matters, Brigand feels useful. The only reason it isn't higher is because some of the top-tier specs simply do everything slightly better. Artifact Chronomancer. Artifact Chronomancer is probably the definition of a high skill cap class. The difference between a beginner and an expert is honestly enormous. Good players make this specialization look incredible. Bad players make it look average. Managing constructs while simultaneously keeping track of cooldowns, positioning, and enemy movement requires a lot of practice. If you're willing to invest that time, the rewards are definitely there. But compared to some of the easier classes on this list, it demands significantly more effort. Honorable mentions. Before wrapping everything up, I want to mention a few classes that are incredibly close to climbing higher. One of those is Godblade Cultist. I've been seeing more and more impressive PvP clips from experienced players, especially during smaller skirmishes. The class has plenty of potential, and I wouldn't be surprised if it moves into A tier after players continue optimizing builds. Another one is Starcaller Warden. This specialization has fantastic utility and performs surprisingly well during coordinated team fights. It's still a bit underexplored, but there's definitely potential here. And finally, the Necromancer. Honestly, this class might be the biggest mystery in Conquest of Azeroth PvP right now. Every week someone discovers another build that completely changes people's opinions. Some focus entirely on summons. Others lean into shadow damage. Others become incredibly difficult to kill. I genuinely think Necromancer could become one of the biggest winners once the meta settles. Final thoughts. Overall, I think Conquest of Azeroth has done an impressive job with PvP balance. Are there stronger classes? Absolutely. Every game has them. But compared to what many of us expected with nearly 70 specializations, the balance is actually pretty healthy. More importantly, player skill still matters. A good player understands positioning, knows when to trade cooldowns, recognizes when to disengage instead of overcommitting. Those decisions win far more fights than simply picking the number one class on a tier list. So if you're trying to decide what to play, choose something that fits your style. If you enjoy assassins, play Stalker. If you love setting up massive burst combos, Demolition Tinker is incredible. If controlling the battlefield sounds fun, Shadow Hunting Witch Doctor is one of the strongest choices available. Whatever you pick, spend time mastering it. Because right now, Conquest of Azeroth rewards experience just as much as class selection. And remember, the meta is going to change. Balance patches are coming. New builds are constantly being discovered. Today's S tier could easily become tomorrow's A tier. So enjoy experimenting while everything is still fresh. If you enjoyed this PvP tier list, make sure to leave a like, subscribe for more Conquest of Azeroth guides, and let me know down below which PvP spec has impressed you the most so far. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.